Now turn to the book of Obadiah. Obadiah, Pride and Prejudice, another title which I oftentimes will use for this book. I call it The High Price for a Bowl of Soup. And you'll see why as we look through it, as we go back and look at some of the Old Testament background. I remember years ago, I was in 8th grade. The minister at the congregation where I grew up in Odessa, Texas, he passed out a test. And, you know, nobody in church likes a test. So it was a pretty unpopular thing. But he passed it out. And it had 100 questions, and you had to go through and answer it. And I remember I was so upset. I came in 3rd place as far as if you look at the grades. I'm probably the only person who remembers that test and remembers the grades that you get. I missed one of the tribes of Israel. I missed one of the apostles. And the 3rd question I missed is, what is the shortest book in the Old Testament? And I racked my brain and could not think of what the shortest book in the Old Testament was. Well, obviously, the reason I'm telling you this tonight is it's the book of Obadiah. And so Obadiah is only 21 verses. So, I mean, who can talk about that for 30 minutes? Well, raise your hand. So we'll see how this goes. As we introduce the book and as we look at it, I want us to start off with this idea of pride and this idea of prejudice. Many people who have written on this in different catechisms and different creeds through the ages, people who are not necessarily members of the Lord's church, but people who have studied Scripture, they say that pride is the gateway to every other sin. Every sin that you think of has a root within it somewhere of pride. And that's really what this book is about. Now, we live in a world in which we are self-reliant. We work for ourselves, pull up ourselves by our own bootstraps. As we look around, we see oftentimes we are where we are in life because of choices we made. How well we did in school, where we went to college, if we went to college, if we joined the military, if we were willing to work overtime, if we're really willing to excel at work. Oftentimes we look at ourselves and we see ourselves as being wherever it is that we have earned. And because of that, because we feel like we've earned where we are, we tend to look down on people. And that's really what this book is about, is folks who look down on other folks. Notice some passages as we get started. Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. Psalm chapter 20 and verse 7 is a very famous one. Some put their trust in chariots and horses, but the psalmist says, some put their trust in chariots and horses. The psalmist says, I will put my faith or my trust in God. You see, when we become prideful, what we do is we put ourselves in the place of God. And we put ourselves where God truly is. Much like in Romans 1, where it says they began to worship the creature rather than the creator. And sometimes we have a problem with that. And so because of that, we look at ourselves and we see pride is prevalent in our culture. And that can be true as an American. There is a place in the Christian life for patriotism. I am proud to be American. I love being an American. I have traveled the world over, and this is my favorite country. I like the food here better than anywhere else. I like the culture here better than anywhere else. I like the standard of living here better than anywhere else. But we've got to be careful in our patriotism. We've got to be careful in the pride we have in our family and the pride in which we have in our accomplishments, that we don't go to a sinful point. You see, we look at our country, and we live in perhaps the most powerful country that has ever existed. Our country has 11 aircraft carriers. Now, to put that in perspective, the entire world has 20. And so we have more than half of all the aircraft carriers in the entire world. As a matter of fact, you can look at just one aircraft carrier, and if you were just to take that one aircraft carrier with its 80 to 96 airplanes that it has upon it, one aircraft carrier would be the 3rd or 4th largest air force in the entire world. That's how powerful our country is. We're not talking about our Air Force. We're not even talking about our whole Navy. We're talking about one aircraft carrier. Our country has over 6,000 nuclear warheads. Russia has a few more than we do, but most people think, as far as technology goes, we are a superior power in that point. We dwarf every other country in this world in our military spending. In 2018, $650 billion was spent on our military. Think about that, $650 billion in 1 year. To put that in perspective, if you were to take every other country, combine them, and double it, you still would not reach what we spend on military spending. And so as we look around at all this power, and as we look around at all the strength that exists in our country, there's some times where we're known as the ugly American, if you would go back to that book written in the 70s. There's some times where people look at America and they become somewhat jealous, but they surely don't like our pride. And they really think that we stand up on a hill and we look down at everybody and we kind of laugh. There's no reason for us to learn a second language. There's no reason for us to make room for anybody else because we see ourselves and our country as highly self-sufficient. Now, if you were to give me the opportunity and the choice and say, would you rather have a larger military than a communist or another country that has ill will? I'd say no. I want the better military. Would you rather live in a different country? Absolutely not. I love this country. But we have to be careful about military. We have to be careful, not about military, we have to be careful about pride. And having a prideful nature in which we look at ourselves and judge ourselves as being better than anybody else. Now, having that in our minds, let's look at the backstory of what's going on here in Obadiah. As you take these 21 verses and begin reading through it, what are we talking about? We're talking about a nation in chapter 1 and verse 1, there's only one chapter, called Edom. And to understand who Edom is, you have to start running through the Bible and look at the backstory. And it's interesting because this backstory actually is going through the entire book. As you go through, you start in Genesis 25. Remember, you got Abraham and Sarah. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac married Rebekah. Remember all this genealogy. Isaac and Rebekah had 2 sons. Now, these 2 sons warred their entire life. As a matter of fact, Esau was born first. He was named Esau because he was red, he was hairy, he just looked like a beast, even as a child. Jacob was named Jacob because he was called a deceiver. They were even fighting in the womb to the point to where when they were born, they were almost born at the same time because Jacob had grabbed Esau's leg and was trying to pull Esau back into the womb so he could be born first. Imagine having children who fought so hard, even when they're in the womb, they're fighting. And it never got any better. And so as you see as they grow up in Genesis 25, 26, and 27, you see where there was always competition. Esau was the jewel of his father's eye. Jacob was the jewel of his mother's eye. And it even caused problems between husband and wife, mom and dad, because these children fought so much. Esau was a manly man. He went out and he hunted. He loved to be out and just kill a certain deer and fix it a certain way that his father loved. Jacob was a man, but he was a different kind of man. He was more of a homebody. He was very good at cooking. His skin was very smooth. He was just very different than his brother. And so as you read through there, you see where Esau one day comes home and he's famished. He's tired. He's not the deepest thinker in the world. And he says, Jacob, you fixed my favorite meal, which is a bowl of beans. And Jacob said, well, I'll give you this meal if you sell me your birthright. Well, Esau knew there was no sense in doing that. That birthright was worth quite a bit. He loved his father, and he wanted to be known by his father, so he wasn't going to give it up. But then Esau thought about it, and he was hungry. He thought he was starving. And he said, if I die of starvation, if nobody fixes me dinner around here, I'm just going to die. Sounds like a typical guy sometimes, doesn't it? He has to have somebody else fix his dinner. And so finally he agreed, and he had Jacob sell him those beans for his birthright. He fooled him into doing that. A little bit later, Jacob once again fooled his father and his brother and stole the blessing of God's promise from Esau. And so you see where Jacob runs away and Esau's chasing him, and you see just how intense this entire story is in the book of Genesis. And finally, it appears near the end with Jacob and Esau as they cross the river. The two brothers finally embrace. Jacob's changed. Now he's named Israel. And he comes to Esau, and Esau forgives him. And they embrace, and things are good. But then among the children, it appears things aren't good. 500 years later, after 400 years of captivity, and after they have gone through the wilderness, we go over to Numbers chapter 20, verses 14 through 20. Israel here is leaving Egypt. They're headed towards the promised land. They need to come through Edom, and Edom says, no, you're not allowed. We hate you. We don't want you in our land. And so there's somewhat of a battle. And that battle is fought, and that battle is known throughout Israel's history. We see when a couple centuries later, 586 BC, when Jerusalem is destroyed, the Edomites, the children of Esau, begin to rejoice. They're happy. They think this is the greatest thing that ever happened. And so you read in Ezekiel 35, verses 1 through 5. You read in Psalm 137, verse 7, where they're rejoicing at the downfall. They believed, or they thought of a word which we use sometimes. It's the word karma. Now, the idea of karma is when you do something, it's going to come right back to you. It's a circular thing. So karma's always going to come back. If you're nice to people, people will be nice to you. If you're mean to people, people will be mean to you. Now, be careful using that word karma, though. It's a Hindu word for their religion, and it's closely related to their thought process about reincarnation. As Christians, we don't believe in karma. It's God who determines what things happen. There's not a mysterious force happening in the world. But sometimes colloquially, we'll use that word karma. So the Edomites are sitting there in their fortress looking down and seeing the Israelites be destroyed, and they're enjoying every moment of it. They think it's karma. These Israelites have always abused them. These Israelites have always tried to fool everybody else, and now they're being destroyed, and they've never seen a thing that makes them more happy. And yet, even though they're being destroyed, even though they're rejoicing, the Lord punishes them. We read in Lamentations 4, 21 through 22, Malachi chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, Isaiah 34, verses 4 through 9, that the conquerors who destroyed Jerusalem are also going to come for Edom. And so now Israel has been destroyed, taken off into captivity. 70 years later, they come back. Edom's destruction is actually worse because they are destroyed, but they never have an opportunity to come back. They never have a homeland ever again. But even though they don't have a homeland, you still see the fighting. Jacob and Esau are still going at it. You see Alexander the Great, when he died, he left his empire to 4 generals. One of the generals was an Idumean, and the Idumeans who lived in that region were the descendants of the Edomites. And they began to rule over Israel, and they began to hurt them. If you study the book of Daniel, if you study the time of between the Testaments, you'll run across a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes. This man hated the Jews. And in 168 BC, he made sure that a sow, a female pig, was sacrificed within the temple to try to desecrate it, to try to destroy the Jewish religion. He did everything he could to kill every single Jew that he could find and to bring everybody into paganism. Guess what his racial background was? He was an Edomite. When we begin reading in the New Testament, you begin reading about the Herods, and the Herods who tried to kill every child around Bethlehem because they were afraid of Jesus. The Herods who judged Jesus and laughed at him and allowed him to be crucified. The Herods who later would kill James and destroy Peter, or tried to destroy Peter before he escaped from prison. What was his race? He was an Idumean. He was an Edomite. So all the way from Genesis 25 all the way to Acts 12, these two brothers, they're fighting. They're getting after it. They're not getting along very well at all. All right, that's the background. That's what we need to see as we go into this book to check things out. And so as we start, we see in chapter 1, there's only one chapter, verses 1 through 9, the coming judgment which will come from Edom. Actually, the book is 2 books. 1 through 14 is one book. 15 through, I think it's 26 is the second book. They kind of work together. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Edom was very prideful. As you look there in chapter 1 and verse 3, notice that the pride of your heart has deceived you. How often do we get so proud and we get so cocky that we end up getting ourselves in trouble? Very few teams ever win the Super Bowl 2 years in a row. Very few baseball teams ever win the World Series 2 years in a row. You know why? Because when you win, you get fat and happy. You get satisfied. You go on all these parades and all these different shows, and you don't work as hard as everybody else. Well, that's what God says to these people. The pride of your heart is going to deceive you. You are known, as you continue along there in verse 3, as fierce warriors. These men used to live in high fortresses. They used to go to places where nobody could even climb up to them, much less be able to fight them. But he lets them know something. Even though you set your nest among the stars, even though you go as high as the eagle, verse 4, God says, I will bring you down. It doesn't matter how powerful, how rich, or how smart you are. God is still God. He is Lord and Lords. He is King of kings. And God would bring them down. And as you look there in verse 5, you see there was no mercy. God will bring them down and he will destroy them. And from verse 7 through 9, all these people in their confederacy, all these people who were great friends, they're going to despair. And they will be absolutely all alone. Now, I want us to take a break from going through this study and to think about that. As we read in the book of Daniel, we read about a great empire, the Babylonian Empire, the empire of gold, as you look at chapter 2 and chapter 3. The Babylonians had established the first major empire. Of course, the Assyrians were a little bit earlier, but they sure didn't compare to the Babylonians. And as Nebuchadnezzar would look over the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the world, and as he would look at his great army and he would look at his great empire, he oftentimes would be pretty self-satisfied with the things that he had done. But as we look in chapter 4, and especially as we look at verse 30, you see where a prophecy which Nebuchadnezzar had been told was fulfilled. Nebuchadnezzar looked over all of his empire and saw all of his power. And at that point, he said, look at how great I am and look what I've accomplished. And at that moment, God brought him down. His nails grew to be like eagles' talons. His hair began to grow out and be shaggy like a sheep or a bull. Everything began to be destroyed about him. Sounds like somebody who is around today. They can't get their nails done and can't get their hair done. But Nebuchadnezzar had it worse than that because he was a madman for 7 times for a good while. He lived as if he was crazy. And not until he was willing to admit God was God, not until he was willing to change his pride, was he restored to his place. You see, God brings down the proud, but he lifts up the humble. You go to the next, in fact, the Old Testament, now to the New Testament. Look there in Acts chapter 12. There we see Herod, of course, by race an Idumean. He was an Edomite, as we might say. And he had a problem with folks in Tyre and Sidon because they hadn't paid taxes. So he went there and they were afraid. And of course, Herod was wearing a new outfit. It was a silver, gold, reflective thing. And as he stood before the people to speak, his outfit began to shine. And these people knew what to do when a politician came around. They began throwing out compliments. And they said, look at Herod. He is a god. He is not a man. He is one of the gods. And Herod became very full of himself. And at that moment, God struck him down. And he didn't just kill him. He made him to die miserably. He was eaten by worms and he died. Josephus tells us that he remained for about 3 or 5 days in absolute misery before finally he gave up the ghost. The reason I bring up Nebuchadnezzar, the reason I bring up Herod is I want us to think about ourselves today. Where were you 4 weeks ago before the pandemic? What was it that was on your mind? What was it that you were thinking about? What was it in your life that was important? Now look today. Are your priorities any different? Is your schedule any different? Is your mind placed in a different place? Has God taken a larger place in your life? You see, God strikes down those who are proud, but he gives grace to the humble. You see, we see that trust in anything but God is futile. Edom had mistreated his brother. We see that in verse 10. See where he's talking about Jacob there in verse 10? He had joined in Jerusalem's destruction, 10 and 11. They had stared and made fun of Israel and their shame, verses 12 through 13. And instead of helping a brother, instead of helping somebody who was hurting, they took advantage of him. Now, what we see here are some hints going through here of the Good Samaritan. A man who was beaten and left on the side of the road as though dead. The priest walked by, the Levite walked by. They looked at him, but they went on the other side of the road and they kept going. These people were supposed to be men of God. These folks who were supposed to be good people kept right on walking. When you and I examine ourselves, and we see somebody, even if that person is an enemy of us, even if they've mistreated us, how often do we see disaster befall them and we say, oh, that's karma. They deserve that. Or how often do we reach out to them? How often do we want to help others? In verse 12, talking about the gazing. In verse 15, we see you should do to others as you would have them do unto you. Don't stare and embarrass somebody who is in a terrible time. Don't look in verse 15 and just laugh at folks, because as you do to others, it will be done to you. But now we go to verse 15. And I want you to notice this is a little bit deeper than where we're going to go to for our lesson tonight. We don't have enough time to get into this necessarily. But you open up and look in verse 15, and you're going to see a phrase. Hopefully you've remembered if you've watched the last couple weeks. For the day of the Lord is near. That needs to ring some bells. For the day of the Lord is near. We're about to transition from Edom to all the nations. And what you'll notice is the way in which the minor prophets are put together, and we'll study this a little bit more as we go later in the series of the books. These books are put together for a certain reason. As you look at it, it works on a hinge, if you will, okay? And this was a common way in which people wrote things in a post-exile period. But the day of the Lord is near. If you'll remember back to Amos, I think it's chapter... Where are you, Amos? Amos chapter 9, verses 11 through 15. You'll see there, the day of the Lord is near. And as you read through 11 and 15 of chapter 9, on that day the Lord shall restore all the kingdoms, and all those kingdoms shall come. When you think about that day of the Lord, remember going back another book, the book of Joel, in Joel chapter 2 and 3, the day of the Lord is the coming of the Spirit. Now, focus on that process, and this is a little bit off the subject of what we're doing, but focus on that process. God is destroying Edom. He's putting down the Gentiles who have hurt the Israel nation, even though he's hurt Israel as well. But there's coming a time where all nations will be the nation of God. Now, when is that? That is in Acts chapter 2. And so in Acts chapter 2 is where we're going to see all nations coming unto God. For this promise, Acts chapter 2 and verse 39, is for you, for your children, and for all those whom the Lord our God shall call. And so it's something pretty important. When you think about that idea of the day of the Lord, it works as a balance. Amos 9, 11 through 15 talks about it, as does Joel 2 and 3. And that's all looking towards Acts 2 and the establishment of the church. You see, as you look here in verse 17 through 18, all nations shall be restored, especially Israel, but Edom shall be destroyed. Now, As we look at that, there's another little play on words going on here. If you look in the Hebrew, the word for Edom is Hadum, okay? Or Hadom, Hadom. Hadom. And what that means is red, means hairy, means dirt, okay? Keep that in your mind. Now go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. And as you read Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, you're going to see God made man. And he named that very first man Adam. We call it Adam, all right? But it's spelled the same in Hebrew for Edom and Adam. There's a lot of implications which are flying across here. First of all, they're both red because they're made out of clay. They both have the same appearance to them. But more so, you'll see a difference when you get to the book of Hebrews and also Galatians between Israel and Hagar, or Ishmael and Edom, Isaac and Edom. You'll see a difference which is there. You'll see the spiritual Adam, which is Christ, and the physical Adam, which is death. See how that works together there? And as you put those together, there's some pretty interesting things to see there. But let's notice verse 21. The very last phrase, which is here, the kingdom shall be the Lord's. You see how he closes that book? The kingdom shall be the Lord's. Now remember where we started. It's all one chapter. Verse 2 and 3. Here's Edom standing up in their tower, watching the Israelites come by, watching them in their shame. As a matter of fact, going down and killing a few of them every once in a while, using them as sport. Here's Edom looking and saying, hey, this is karma. You deserve all of this because all the things the Israelites have ever done, they deserve this. Here's Edom thinking that they're as high as an eagle, thinking that they've reached up to the heavens and nobody can compare to them. The book ends and it says there's only one God. There's only one who's in charge. The kingdom is the Lord. Two main points I want us to look at. First and foremost is this: God is God, and I am not. God is God, and I am not. Every one of us needs to say that. God is God, and I am not. No matter how impregnable I may feel, no matter how powerful I may feel, no matter how rich I may be, how smart I may be, how strong I may be, only God is God. And we must worship him. Lesson number 2. We see the result of carnal mindedness. We see the result of worldly mindedness. All the way back to the ancestors. Esau. Abraham had been promised to be a father of many nations and to bless all people. Isaac had been promised to be a father of many nations and bless all people. It was going to come to the line, and Esau said, I want some soup. Who would exchange that for soup? Somebody who's worldly minded. And we laugh at that. But how many people today have exchanged the fleeting opportunity of sexual immorality for eternal life? How many of us are so busy we don't pay attention to our families because we've got other priorities and other ideas and other things which are pressing? Carnal mindedness is not the way to go. Have a spiritual mind. Put God first in everything that you do. We live in a wonderful nation. We are blessed greatly above all others. But don't allow yourself to trust in yourself. Instead, always trust in God. Psalm chapter 20 and verse 7, some put their trust in chariots and horses. I will put my trust in God.